Once upon a time, in a valley where the sunflowers grew as tall as castle towers, and the air always smelled faintly of warm honey and clover, there was a place called the Meadow Jousting Field. It was not like any jousting field you might have seen in a history book. Oh no, this field had soft, springy grass the color of emeralds, colorful banners fluttering in the breeze, and the very best thing of all, the jousting was done on friendly dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were kind and gentle creatures. They wore little velvet saddle blankets embroidered with stars, and they loved children more than almost anything else in the world. The Triceratops were the steadiest riders, good for beginners. The ankylosaurs liked to waddle and make everyone laugh. And then there were the Parasaurolophuses, who honked the most magnificent honks whenever someone did something especially brave. Figgy had been coming to the Meadow Jousting Field all summer. Figgy had messy chestnut hair, a gap-toothed smile, and a heart so full of excitement it sometimes felt like it might right out of their chest. Tonight, however, was the most important night of all, the Starlight Junior Joust. The field was lit by 1,000 warm golden lanterns hung between the banners, and every child who competed received a crown of woven wildflowers. Figgy's favorite dinosaur was a stout little ankylosaurus named Bumble. Bumble had soft mossy green scales, enormous dark eyes like polished chestnuts, and a habit of sneezing at exactly the wrong moment. But Figgy loved Bumble completely. They had practiced their jousting run all week, galloping gently down the lane with a foam-tipped lance and a heart full of hope. Standing near the competitor's tent was Pipera, who was 10 years old and had arrived at the jousting field in the most extraordinary way, on one foot. Pipera was a ballerina, and she never quite stopped moving like one. Even when she was waiting in line, her free hand would flutter upward like a swan's wing, and her toes would point without her even noticing. She was riding a tall, graceful Parasaurolophus named Aria, and together they looked absolutely magnificent. "I've been training for 3 months," Pipera told Figgy with a kind but confident smile. "I just think of the joust like a dance. Slow, then fast, then slow again. Breathe in time with your dinosaur." Figgy nodded and tried to remember all of that. Breathe. Slow, fast, slow. Got it. Hiding behind the water trough near the entrance gate was a small girl with 2 braids and enormous round glasses. Her name was Cleo, and she was 6 years old and extraordinarily shy, but she was also the world's biggest dinosaur expert, at least in her own very important opinion. Cleo had encyclopedias about dinosaurs stacked beside her bed. She could name every species, every era, every tooth pattern, and yet she had never once ridden a dinosaur herself. "Are you going to joust?" Figgy asked her gently, crouching down to be at Cleo's level. Cleo shook her head hard. "I know everything about dinosaurs," she whispered, "but I'm scared I'll do it wrong." Figgy smiled softly. "Me too, a little bit. Do you want to watch from Bumble's back? He's very calm. He mostly just sneezes." Cleo thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she nodded. Just as Cleo climbed carefully up onto Bumble and wrapped her small arms around Figgy's middle, something enormous and wonderful swooped over the field. It was a pterodactyl, but not a fierce one. This pterodactyl wore a tiny postman's satchel across its leathery chest, and the satchel was stuffed not with letters or parcels, but with scrolls. Bedtime story scrolls. The pterodactyl's name was Parch, and every evening at dusk, Parch flew over the valley delivering bedtime stories to children who needed them most. Stories, lovely stories. Who needs a story tonight? Parch called in a raspy but surprisingly cheerful voice, circling the lantern-lit field. After the joust, everyone called back, and Parch made a big, satisfied loop in the golden sky and settled on top of the royal box to wait. The junior joust began. Pipera went first. She and Arya moved together like water and moonlight, perfectly, beautifully, breathtakingly in time. The crowd gasped. The Parasaurolophus honked 3 magnificent honks. Pipera dismounted in a pirouette and bowed so gracefully that even the dinosaurs watching seemed to sigh with admiration. Then it was Figgy's turn. Figgy climbed back onto Bumble and took the foam lance from the attendant. Cleo stayed at the edge of the lane, clutching her braids and watching with wide, hopeful eyes behind her enormous glasses. Figgy breathed, slow, fast, slow. Breathe with Bumble. Bumble began to trot. The lanterns blurred into ribbons of warm gold. The target at the end of the lane, a spinning wooden dragon painted cheerful blue, grew closer and closer. Figgy raised the lance. The crowd held its breath. And then Bumble sneezed. It was an enormous sneeze, the kind that Bumble was famous for. Bumble lurched sideways, the lance wobbled, and Figgy's aim went completely haywire. Instead of hitting the spinning dragon, the foam tip bounced off the wooden post, ricocheted sideways, and bonked Parch the pterodactyl right on the beak. Parch let out an indignant squawk. Scrolls rained down from the satchel like paper snowflakes. The crowd burst into surprised laughter, warm laughter, kind laughter, the sort that isn't laughing at you, but simply because the world is wonderfully strange. Figgy slid off Bumble and stood in the middle of the lane, cheeks burning red. "I'm so sorry," Figgy said, mostly to Parch, but also to everyone, and also a little bit to the spinning wooden dragon. "Oh, my beak," Parch muttered, then ruffled his wings and tilted his great head. "No harm done, small one. Beaks are tougher than they look." Cleo came running across the field, arms full of fallen story scrolls. "I got them," she announced breathlessly, pushing up her glasses. "I got all the scrolls." And then, before she seemed to realize what she was doing, she climbed right back up onto Bumble all by herself. She looked startled. Bumble looked delighted. The crowd cheered. Pipera jogged over too and put an arm around Figgy's shoulders. "You know what my ballet teacher told me the first time I fell on stage?" she said. "She said making a mistake does not make you bad. It makes you human. It means you tried. That's the bravest thing there is." Figgy felt something loosen in their chest, something tight and embarrassed that had been clenched up like a little fist. It softened, and in its place came something warmer, something like peace. "I tried," Figgy said quietly. "I really did try." "You really did," Cleo agreed firmly, from up on Bumble's back, with all the authority of the world's foremost 6-year-old dinosaur expert. Parch gathered the last of his scrolls, tucked them neatly back into his satchel, and then, because it was getting late and the stars were beginning to appear above the meadow mist field, he pulled out one very special scroll. It was tied with a silver ribbon and sealed with a wax stamp shaped like a tiny sleeping moon. "This one," Parch announced, "is for Figgy." Figgy opened it. Inside, in looping letters the color of midnight blue, was a story about a prehistoric knight. A brave, clumsy, wonderfully imperfect knight who had once owned a pair of enchanted ice skates. The skates were silver and ancient, with blades that never rusted and laces that always held tight no matter how many times the knight tumbled and fell. The knight had made every kind of mistake imaginable. Tripped on his own cape, called the king by the wrong name, once accidentally jousted a scarecrow while the actual opponent stood politely to one side. But every time the knight fell, he laced up those old skates, got back to his feet, and glided forward. "Where are the skates now?" Figgy asked Parch. Parch reached deep into his satchel and pulled out the most extraordinary pair of ice skates Figgy had ever seen. They were silver white, shimmering like the inside of a shell, and they glowed with a faint soft light the color of starshine. "Wherever they go," Parch said gently, setting them in Figgy's hands, "they remind you falling is just part of moving forward." Figgy held the skates for a long, quiet moment. They were cool and smooth, and they hummed very softly, like a lullaby just barely out of hearing range. By now the Starlight Joust was over, and the lanterns were dimming one by one, burning down to the softest amber glow. The dinosaurs were settled in their velvet-lined stables, breathing long and slow. Pipera had found a patch of soft grass and was lying on her back, watching the first stars appear, her arms folded behind her head and her pointed toes finally still. Cleo sat beside Figgy, her braids unraveled and her glasses slightly lopsided, already halfway through one of Parch's story scrolls, even though her eyes were drooping. Figgy lay back on the warm grass, holding the ice skates against their chest. The night air was cool and sweet. Above, the sky was deep velvet, pricked all over with gold. Parch sat nearby on the fence post, reading from a scroll in a low, rumbling voice, just the right sort of voice for sending children off to sleep. Figgy thought about the lance going sideways, about Bumble's sneeze, about the scrolls raining down. And for the first time, instead of feeling the hot rush of embarrassment, Figgy felt something else entirely, something gentle. Something like being proud, not of being perfect, but of trying, of getting back up, of lacing the skates and gliding forward anyway. The stars were very bright now. Figgy's eyelids were very heavy. Bumble let out one last tiny sleepy sneeze from the stables, and Figgy smiled. Then came a yawn. A big, slow, wonderful yawn that stretched all the way from Figgy's toes to the tips of their fingers. The ice skates were still warm in Figgy's arms. The stars blurred softly. Parch's voice drifted lower and lower, like a boat settling onto still water. And Figgy, brave and imperfect and wonderfully human, closed both eyes and drifted off to sleep.